Welcome to the Essential Tax Podcast with your host, Mishkin Santa. In each episode, we'll take the complex world of tax, all the jargon, acronyms, and stuff that make your eyes glaze over, and explain it in an impactful way to understand the complex and unknown areas. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, thewolfgroup.com. Now, here's the host of Essential Tax Podcast, Mishkin Santa.
Okay, hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. We've got one of our I call them frequent flyers, people that come back on the podcast regularly. We've got Becki Young here today. Becki, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here with you.
So I asked Becki to come back on to the podcast today because I've been getting a lot of questions throughout 2025 from various folks that have, whether they have green cards or different types of non-immigrant visas. And what they're really asking is about, okay, I'm thinking about either giving up my green card or becoming a US citizen or basically trying to get the path to citizenship. And, have you had any experience in that? Do you have any other clients that have gone through that? How does, filing my taxes play into that? And I'm not very aware of the process for naturalization to US citizenship in general. I'm also not very aware of the current landscape of what's going on there. So I thought we'd bring Becki in, and Becki could maybe give us some of the inside baseball on what's happening here in 2026 for folks that are maybe thinking about, okay, I just want to get that U.S. citizenship. I want to get that secured. So we're going to do the standard laundry list of questions for Becki in this. So Becki, tell us what you're seeing is the current landscape for people that are looking to obtain citizenship here in 2026.
Thanks, Mish. So first of all, I would say that we're getting similar questions in our practice, in our immigration law practice, as you're getting in your tax practice. So definitely people with green cards trying to figure out whether they want to give up their green cards or whether they want to move to citizenship. And I think that's definitely a trend that's happened in the past year. More people with green cards are thinking about that question. Historically, a lot of people just have green cards and remain permanent residents for a long time. But now people are really sort of feeling pressed into a decision about whether to go backwards or forward. So the law around citizenship and naturalization really hasn't changed in the past year. The legal structure and the statute remains the same. To become a citizen once you are a permanent resident, you typically have to have held a green card for 5 years or longer, unless you're married to a US citizen, in which you can apply after 3 years. There are a few other exceptions, but those are the general rules. So that hasn't changed. What has changed are things like the enforcement posture, the processing times, and the level of scrutiny that we're seeing. So the current administration and the Immigration Service is looking really closely at travel history. They're looking really closely at tax compliance, which is where you come in, and they're looking really closely at good moral character. So those are things that have always been a part of the process, but that are really, a focus of this administration right now. And I think, where people who want to apply for naturalization should be thinking what they should be thinking about.
Okay, let's talk about those requirements real quick, since you mentioned them. What counts as good moral character these days? I think we all have our own individual opinions as to what may count as good moral character, but from the government's perspective, what are they deeming to be good moral character?
Yeah, and there's case law and there are objective thoughts about good moral character, but certainly paying your taxes is part of good moral character. And so to the extent that you have unpaid taxes or delayed taxes, that can certainly play into a determination of good moral character. And so from a tax perspective, certainly getting caught up on any back taxes and getting into sort of a payment plan if you owe taxes to the IRS are really important. Other things that comprise good moral character include paying child support. So if you have outstanding child support, that's absolutely going to count against you. And certain criminal issues, any sort of serious criminal issue within sort of the look back period, which is the 5 year or 3 year period before the application, will be part of that process. Those are some of the big ones. And I think that, something to know about good moral character is it's always been part of the process, but it's really a focus of this administration to the extent that they are doing some neighborhood checks. And I don't mean to scare anyone. I mean, it's not that in every case that they're going to go to your neighborhood and talk to your neighbors, but if they do have any suspicions about criminal activity or other serious issues, they have been doing an investigation, sort of like if one of your neighbors applies for a high level security clearance, you might have had investigators visit your house and ask you about your neighbor. They are doing that to ask neighbors about good moral character in the context of naturalization in some, unusual cases.
And what about social media? Are they saying give us the logins for your social media page? Or are they looking at it objectively if it's open to the public? Are they doing a deep dive into that as part of good moral character? Or
So, one thing that we've seen, not specifically in naturalization, but just with any filings made to the Immigration Service, is that they're using AI scrubbing to collect data that maybe lies deeper in the internet than, say, your public Facebook page. So, they're really trying to find any information that might be out there on the internet about you relating to anything that's, considered not to be in good moral character.
right. So in my head, I'm thinking, if you're making comments on Reddit or you're in certain chat groups or chat functions, again, everything that you put out there, whether it's anonymous or not, you really should think through kind of the impact that could come back to have on you. Let's wheel back for a second and really try to. I want to kind of do this in a kind of pyramid where we kind of go and we go downward. So I want to start at the top here. We talked about the green card and people having the issue of, okay, I'm going to give up my green card versus I'm just going to go for US citizenship. Are there certain visas or statuses that are better to apply for US citizenship? Is the green card the penultimate status that gets you into the US citizenship, or are there other visas or statuses? And I know we have these new things, the gold card, the platinum card, and all that stuff. But in your outside of the realm of those, is there like, if I'm coming to you and I'm an E2 or E3 or something like that, is that also a potential path? Or what's your 2 cents on that?
Well, and first of all, I would say I have my own opinions about the gold card and the platinum card, which is probably a subject for an entirely different conversation. But those
Absolutely.
are basically green cards. So, to answer your question, the only status that allows you to move to citizenship is a green card.
Okay.
Now, I guess I should say there are certain very rare exceptions where somebody might have derived US citizenship from a parent or a grandparent, and they sort of go straight from being a foreign national living in a foreign country to being a US citizen. But in general, you have to be a permanent resident and have a green card in order to become a citizen. So if you have an E2 visa, you're going to need to move through a green card to become a citizen. If you have an H1B, if you have an L1, that does not lead to citizenship. The first step is always a green card.
Okay. And how long does someone need to have the green card before they can apply for citizenship? So let's just say I won the lottery tomorrow and I got the green card. Can I then like immediately make an application for citizenship, or do I need to hold the green card for a series of years?
So first of all, if you won the lottery tomorrow, you wouldn't have the green card tomorrow. But let's assume that you won the lottery tomorrow and then you got the green card.
Okay.
Once you become a permanent resident, the default rule is 5 years to apply for citizenship. But there is a special rule for spouses of U.S. citizens. So if you're married to a U.S. citizen and you've been married to that same U.S. citizen for 3 years, then you can apply after 3 years. So, and one interesting side note, you don't have to have applied for your green card through that citizen. So, if you got a green card through work, but you were married to a US citizen at that time and you remain married to a US citizen, then you can apply after 3 years.
Okay. And what about children? Let's say a green card holder married to a U.S. citizen, but then they also have a U.S. citizen child. Does the child help out too, or
So if the children are minors, they can become citizens with their parents. Is that what you're asking?
yeah? Or if the child is a U.S. citizen, let's say we have two green card holders, and then they have a child that's a U.S. citizen.
Hmm.
Would having the child as a U.S. citizen be helpful to both of them?
Having a US citizen child doesn't impact your timeline for naturalization.
Okay.
It does allow you, when the child turns 21, if you don't have a green card, like let's say that you're an E2 and your child is a US citizen, when your child turns 21, they can sponsor you for a green card, but it doesn't help or harm your timeline or process for naturalization in any way.
Okay. And one of the things you mentioned at the very beginning was that you said that they would take a look at your dates of travel, and so let's talk about that for a second. I assume that physical presence and continuous residence requirements are needed. Talk to me about the timeline for being in and outside of the United States. Like, what happens if I'm spending 4 months out of the U.S. and 8 months inside the U.S. on a regular basis? Is that going to hurt me? What kind of travel is kind of the sweet spot that I can maintain as a green card holder and still be okay?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, there are requirements both for physical presence and for continuous residence. So, physical presence maybe is easier. So, let's start with that.
Okay.
So, you have to have been in the US for at least half of the period, whether it's 5 years as the default or 3 years for the spouse of a US citizen. You have to have spent at least half of that 5 or 3 year period in the United States. So, that's the physical presence requirement. And that's really a good rule of thumb for permanent residents in general. When someone tells me they want to become a permanent resident, but also they have strong ties to their home country, maybe they have a company there, maybe they have a vacation home there, they want to spend a lot of time outside the US. I always say if you're not going to spend at least half your time in the US, don't become a permanent resident because typically this is a separate subject from citizenship, but typically you need to spend at least half your time in the US to maintain your green card. And if you don't, you can lose your green card. So again, so that's unrelated to citizenship, but it's sort of the same rule. To be eligible for naturalization, you need to have spent half of the 3 or 5 year period there. The other thing is continuous residence. And so that relates to the duration of trips that you've taken outside the United States. And if you consider that your primary residence is in the United States, which is required for permanent residence, then anytime you travel outside the United States, that could break the continuity of your residence for naturalization purposes. So typically, trips of 6 months or less do not break the continuity of your residence. So if you take a trip of 4 months, let's say you want to go home for the summer for 4 months, that should be totally fine. But if you take a trip of 7 months, that might be a problem. And if you take a trip of more than 1 year, you don't enter the US within a 1 year period, then legally speaking, your green card becomes void. Having said that, people are still admitted sometimes after a 1 year period of stay, but definitely a 1 year period of stay outside the US will cause problems, will break continuous residence for naturalization purposes. Even a 6 months period of stay can be problematic. And so basically the advice for green card holders is don't ever stay outside the US for at least 6 months. If you have to do that, there's something called a reentry permit, which you can apply for to preserve your residence. But unless you have a reentry permit, you should not spend more than 6 months in a row outside the US.
Okay. All right. And let's talk about, you mentioned also tax filing requirements. And I know that you're not coming on here as a tax specialist. Obviously, that's my role on here. But can you give some examples of some questions that you maybe get about tax compliance or unpaid taxes or anything like that that you normally see when it comes to the citizenship application?
So, first of all, if somebody comes to us and they have unpaid taxes that they haven't resolved with the IRS, that's the first thing that we do is send them to someone like you to get their tax issues resolved before they apply for citizenship, because you don't want to apply for citizenship with unresolved tax issues. That would definitely result in a finding of lack of good moral character, which is not a place you want to be. So, resolving, paying outstanding taxes or getting on a plan to pay outstanding taxes with the IRS is critical. There's a question on the application that said, have you always filed your taxes since becoming a permanent resident? Have you always filed as a resident? Which is important. As you know, there's a difference between being a tax resident and a permanent resident. But if you are a permanent resident, you're supposed to maintain your permanent residence in the US. So you should be a tax resident as well as a permanent resident.
Yeah, and I think what Becki is referring to is that we sometimes see clients, and again, I normally see this in the context of people that win the lottery. It's really funny, you're talking about coming into the US for 6 months, but we see these people that win the lottery and then they basically just want to stay in their home country. They don't want to come in, and they want to file treaty tiebreaker. And I'm like, well, what's the point? Your green card is going to be void for immigration. You are basically, doing a treaty tiebreaker to be a non-resident. So from US tax purposes, you are, a non-resident alien. You're not really kind of in the spirit of the green card or the green card process. And we have several clients that we continue to do that for, and I'm not really sure why they're continuing to hold that green card, or if they think that will somehow be an advantage to them, especially now. Oh, I want to use it to come back in to see my child that's going to college in the East Coast or the West Coast or whatever it is. I want to be able to come and go as I please. And I'm like, I'm not certain that that's going to end up being the long-term thing that's going to help you out there. But that's generally where we see that coming into play. And that, generally is not going to be something that's going to help them out long-term if they ever want to convert to, say, or get their green card kind of redone.
Yeah, I would say that's probably not a great plan, to live outside the US and travel in. I would also say, sort of historically, I've been doing this work for 30 some years, and there hasn't been real information sharing between the IRS and the Immigration Service, but there is now. And so, to the extent that you're a permanent resident and you're filing your taxes as a non resident, it's certainly possible that that information, which has not previously come to light, could come to light. And permanent resident, I mean, this is not my area of expertise, but I don't think permanent residents should be filing their taxes legally as non-residents.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And for the audience out there, I just want to run through a couple things that everyone should be aware of. So, first of all, the normal statute of limitations for audit and examination of a tax return is 3 years. That's the statute of limitations for just basic tax compliance. So when someone says to me, I think I've got some issues with maybe unreported income or something's not done correctly, my basic default is, okay, let me see your last 3 years of tax returns. Let's work through it together. Let's kind of do a deep dive and see, what's going on there. You can also, through your IRS online account, pull what we call account transcripts, which is what the government will also look at. Those will detail if there's any issues on the IRS side. So a lot of people don't realize you could be under audit and examination by the IRS and not even know it. Like, they may not have sent you anything, but if you look at those account transcripts, the code will tell you. There's different transaction codes that go on there. And if you know how to read them, former IRS here, yeah, I know how to read those, will tell you, exactly kind of where you stand at with the IRS. The second thing to understand is that there is an IRS policy, I think it's P-1-155, which the IRS basically, their internal policy is that as long as your last 6 years of tax returns have been filed correctly, they will deem you to be in full compliance. So that there's a 6-year kind of look back from the IRS perspective. So, for example, if you're trying to do an installment agreement or an offer in compromise or any kind of negotiating with the IRS, they're going to want to see 6 years on file, okay? And then the last thing I'll point out is that and I say this because green card holders generally will have offshore financial assets, offshore income. If there's what we call an international informational filing requirement, whether it's under FATCA, which is the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, the report of foreign bank accounts, foreign trust reporting, foreign corporate reporting, foreign brokerage account reporting, foreign life insurance, something to do under that nature, and you haven't filed those forms, the big problem that you have there is that the IRS rules basically say that the statute of limitations to audit your tax return is forever. Now, will the IRS go back and do that forever? Probably not. We're here in 2026 now. What's the likelihood that the IRS would ask you to go back and correct something from, say, 2015 or 2016? It's probably very low, but it kind of gives this open-ended statute that the IRS can play around with, and a little bit of a stick that they can hit you with. And so in general, what I like to tell people is, let's take a look at what you've got going on for the last 3 to 6 years. If you're really serious about, going into US citizenship from the green card, or even the other way around, if you're serious about potentially doing the exit, giving up the green card, and you could be subject to the US exit tax. One of the issues there is that your last 5 years, according to 877 Cap A, has to be done correctly. Your last 5 years of returns. So I generally like to look at about 6 years in total, though, get a good feel for everything. And then from there, you can kind of give the client, advice on either side of the fence. That's my diatribe for taxes. I will move on from that unless you want to add anything there, Becki.
No, I think that sounds good. And that's why my accountant always tells me to keep my tax returns for 7 years, I guess.
Yeah, no, 7 years is a good rule of thumb. I like that. And generally speaking, I would tell anybody that's probably what you need to do for both tax returns, and then any kind of informational filing. If for example you have W-2s, 1099s, just keep all that in a folder, stick it somewhere. Don't be like my parents. Though. I was in my parents' garage the other day, and my dad had tax returns from like 1992, paper tax returns just sitting in his garage. And I said, wow, the wrong person walks in here and you're going to be a victim of identity theft real fast. So don't do that, but maybe just kind of keep stuff in a secure, online or secure digital place. Okay, let's move on to another topic here. So do you have any best practice tips that you generally provide your clients? So if someone comes to you and says, hey, Becki, I've held the green card now for 10 years. We're thinking, the U.S. this is going to be, where we're going to be at for the foreseeable future. We want to become U.S. citizens, and we want to start the application process. Do you have any best practices or tips that you kind of just generally tell everybody?
Well, we definitely talk about taxes. That's part of the conversation. We definitely talk about good moral character and criminal history. One of the things that comes up in some populations is selective service. So if you lived in the US as a permanent resident before the age of 26, you should have registered for the selective service. So that can sometimes be an issue in citizenship cases. And so I think that criminal history and taxes and travel history are the three sort of biggest things that tend to come up in our cases. Sometimes, especially with clients who have really international lifestyles and travel frequently, they have a really hard time reconstructing their travel history. And so, to the extent that you have not been outside the US for more than 6 months in a row, that makes things easier. We can sometimes submit an attestation that says, these are my travel dates to the best of my recollection. And I can attest that I've never been outside the US for more than 6 months at a time, and that I have spent at least half of the past 5 years in the United States. But if someone gets a green card through our firm, we tell them to keep track of their travel outside the US because it's easier to put it together prospectively than to try to recreate it after the fact. We talk to people about the rights and responsibilities of US citizenship versus permanent residence. And there is a test at the end of the naturalization process. It's not that hard. There are 100 questions that you get in advance along with the answers. You have to study those 100 questions, and then they will ask you them. And once you get 6 right, you're done. So if you're diligent about studying the questions, that part is not difficult. Although we have had clients who have not passed it, so it is
No.
to study. There is an English language requirement. So some people, can have a challenge in meeting the English language requirement. So we would certainly screen people for English language, make sure that they're prepared for the test. Some clients actually want us to help prepare for the test. And, if we notice that they're not able to answer the questions within a few days of their interview, we would definitely light a fire under them. So those are just, there are a lot of considerations, but those are some of the things that we talk about when someone comes to us and wants to naturalize.
Okay. So yeah, let's dig deeper into that for a second. So I've applied for the citizenship, and I guess they say, okay, it's tentatively granted, but you just have to go and take the test. Are there any other things to be aware of in that entire, like, okay, you're right there at the end, but these are the last little steps. Obviously, there's a test, then you got to do the oath and all that stuff. And what does that normally look like as far as the timeline and the process?
Yeah, and by the way, they would not tell you that you were like tentatively granted, but you have to do the interview. So you don't really know anything until you go to the interview. But you would file the case with the immigration service, and they would send you a receipt notice, and then they would send you a biometrics notice. So you have to go to a location where you would complete fingerprints and photographs. So that would be the next step after filing, receipt, biometrics, and then you wait for your interview. And as I said, in Washington, D.C., that's like 8 to 12 months. You would be called into the district office. So if you live in Maryland, that's in Baltimore. If you live in D.C. or Virginia, that's in Fairfax. If you live in a
Oh,
different state, it would be a different location, but those are the two D.C. area offices. And so you would go in and meet with an examiner. They will go over the application with you. They'll go over sort of the biometrics questions, your address history, your travel history. They will ask you, there's a long list of questions about, things like, are you a Nazi? Are you a communist? Do you have any aggravated felonies? So hopefully the answer is no to all of those questions, but they will review them with you. And then there are also some sort of affirmative questions like, do you support the Constitution of the United States, etc., the laws of the United States? And then they will give you the civics exam. They'll give you the English language exam. And one thing I should have mentioned is when you file the application, you actually have an option to change your name. So some people, without going through sort of the regular, very cumbersome judicial process. So some people do choose to change their name. And if you don't choose to change your name, you'll be sworn in by a bureaucrat, by an officer of the immigration service. Back in the day, they would sometimes swear you in on the same day. I haven't seen that recently. So typically it's like a few weeks up to a few months between your interview and swearing in. Um, but if you choose to change your name, typically you have to go in front of a federal judge. So that can sometimes take a little longer. It's still a good plan if you wish to change your name. That's a great time to do it because it makes it more efficient. But it does mean that your swearing in has to be in front of a judge.
okay, interesting. I did not know that. So I could have been filing a tax return with someone on a green card that's got a different name, and then they get the citizenship and they have a different name at that point in time, and everything has to get changed over and put in correctly into the tax return for that.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So you go in, you do all that stuff, you go take the oath, and then you're done. That's it. Is there a certificate you get? Is there something after that, or you just get the passport, or what happens after you get that done?
So you will receive a naturalization certificate after you are sworn in, and they typically hand it to you that day, so you have it immediately. If you want a US passport, and most people who naturalize are international travelers, so they typically do apply for a US passport, you're eligible immediately to apply for a passport. And if you think that you're going to need to do international travel, that's a good idea just to do it right away. We have had a few sort of complicated situations where somebody was planning to be naturalized, but also knew that they needed to do international travel. And once you're a US citizen, you can't travel without a US passport. So you either have to get a US passport immediately or you have to delay your swearing in so that you can travel on your old passport. But you can't, once you've been sworn in, you can't travel on your old passport.
Okay, got it. And what about voting? Can you just, let's just say I get sworn in, next Friday, and then there's an election the following Tuesday. Would I then be able to, I've got my naturalization certificate. Would I then be able to go and vote, or how does that work?
So you will be immediately eligible to vote in federal elections. What evidence you would need to provide to be able to vote in federal elections, I think, is a subject, if you've picked up a newspaper recently, is a subject of major national debate.
Yep.
But certainly a U.S. passport will be sufficient. And hopefully other documents such as a naturalization certificate will also be deemed sufficient. But you are legally eligible to vote as soon as you are sworn in and have that certificate.
Okay. Now I got two more questions for you, and then we'll wrap it up here. But can you tell our audience a little bit about? So we just went through the naturalization process. Can you just kind of tell our audience about the other side of the coin, which is what we call denaturalization? Like, what is that? And have there been any big changes with denaturalization? Like, do we see that happening? I know that certain headlines were made about oh, we'll pull, we don't like celebrity X, and they're living in foreign country Y, and that person's citizenship should be revoked or whatever. But talk to us about, which I don't think is denaturalization. I think that's different, but maybe it is. I don't know. But tell us about denaturalization and tell us about what's going on with that.
Sure. So yeah, I think that there are, first of all, legally there's a distinction between denaturalization, which is someone who was not born a U.S. citizen, who became a U.S. citizen through naturalization, and then there's a process for the government to take that away, versus someone who's a U.S. born U.S. citizen, for whom the government really can't take away citizenship, despite what they might threaten under current law. So we're talking about the denaturalization process for someone who became a citizen through naturalization. And that I think phrase has been thrown around somewhat lately by this current administration, a lot of threats about denaturalization. The denaturalization process legally is quite cumbersome and difficult for the government, because being a U.S. citizen is sort of the ultimate membership in this club, right? I mean, it comes with certain protections and privileges, and one is that it's very hard to take it away. Really, the only circumstances under which legally it can be taken away is if you committed fraud or made a misrepresentation in your application about something material. So if you lied about your eye color or your weight, they're not going to take away your citizenship. But if you lied about the fact that you are a Nazi or an aggravated felon, those are things that are considered material misrepresentation. So if the Immigration Service had known the truth, they would not have naturalized you. And so and sort of historically speaking, there have been very few cases of denaturalization, and most of them related to people who hid their Nazi ties or Nazi background.
Okay.
But anything that is material that would have caused the Immigration Service not to approve your case, if you hide it, could be grounds for denaturalization. But again, it's a very cumbersome and time-consuming process for the government, and that it wouldn't be possible to sort of engage in mass denaturalizations, at least under current law.
Yeah, believe it or not, this debate about denaturalization has hit the tax community, because the people have postulated that if a naturalized citizen is then denaturalized, then would the U.S. exit tax immediately apply? And some people have pointed to, and I think I took I was at a conference, I was a speaker at a conference, and there were several speakers that had brought up really old tax cases from like the 1920s. And I was the last one to go, and I said, I got everyone beat. I got a Supreme Court case from the 1912 about denaturalization. And basically the Supreme Court says if you're denaturalized, it's as if you never got your citizenship to begin with. So the exit tax would not kick in, at least under the Supreme Court case, for a denaturalized citizen. But now then the question becomes, do you fall within those green card rules? Because again, technically you've given up your green card to become a U.S. citizen. So if we're back to that, then maybe you're hitting the exit tax under the green card test. I don't know how that would work or not, but that's where the discussion flows at today. All right, last question for you, because I have to ask. I'm always just very curious what people think. There is this Exclusive Citizenship Act of 2025, which I think I've talked about in a couple of my presentations, because I'm not certain it has very much traction for actually passing. But my understanding of this is that if this were to pass, And there are many countries in the world that have this, where you can only have the citizenship from that country. I think the Netherlands is a good example where you can't be a dual citizen. Austria, I believe, is another one. But basically, under this act, if it were to pass, and you are a U.S. citizen and you have dual citizenship with another country, you basically, I think, have 180 days to give up the other citizenship. And if you don't, then you're deemed to have given up your U.S. citizenship. So, wanted to get your thoughts on this act that was proposed. And again, I don't think it's got much traction. I don't think it's even come to a potential vote. So, what are your thoughts on the Exclusive Citizenship Act of 2025?
So, regarding this particular piece of legislation, I would agree with you completely that it has no traction. It isn't going anywhere. We get asked a lot about it a lot, and that's what I tell people. I'm not really concerned. But I think the topic of the legislation is really an interesting and important one. In our practice, we've seen in the past year a hugely increased interest from American citizens in obtaining a second nationality. And that could be either through investment. There are some countries that have had a program for citizenship by investment, like Spain and Portugal. There are also many countries that have programs for citizenship by ancestry or descent. And so we have been doing a lot of consultations in the past year with US citizens who are looking into these options. And then, of course, when this legislation was proposed, they all called us and said, oh my goodness, what does this mean? Am I going to lose my US citizenship? So I don't think that bill is going anywhere. I don't think that it's possible under current law for that to happen. But I think it is interesting to think about this concept of dual citizenship, and it's something I've been following myself for many years. Probably 20 or 30 years ago, there were many fewer countries that allowed dual citizenship, but the trend over time has been an increasing number of countries that allow it. And typically the US has not cared if someone naturalizes and wants to retain their home country citizenship. That isn't a problem. So there are many, many dual citizens who have naturalized in the US. And, that's always been considered okay. You do have to take the oath of allegiance. You renounce and abjure your allegiance to any other prince or potentate. But as long as you're willing to do that, then you should be good. So that's my thought on the Citizenship Act.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And in my world, this has been going on for quite some time. That I said several years ago that the name of the game is how many passports can I obtain. I see a lot of U.S. folks just trying to, can we get into Portugal? Can we get into Cyprus? Can we get into Malta? In fact, I'm considering doing an entire series on, cross-border U.S. cross-border going outbound into various countries. I've got one on Portugal and one on Cyprus already kind of documented, but I'd like to get some of these other countries that are kind of now the hot flavor of the day, if you will. Greece, Malta. There's different programs throughout the world, and those things kind of evolve. I think we'll see more and more of this come through. So it's an interesting bill, but as I've said, I doubt it goes anywhere. But it's an interesting concept and certainly plays into the national conversation a little bit. Becki, you've come on to the show and hit it right out of the ballpark. Fantastic rundown. Hopefully the audience and the listeners kind of got some good intel on what the process looks like to become a U.S. citizen. And, can folks reach out to you at your firm if they have an interest and want to particularly talk, with you about the next steps for this type of action?
Absolutely. My colleagues and I are available to consult. If these are issues that you would like to discuss, feel free to reach out.
All right. Fantastic. Well, thanks for coming on again, Becki.
Thanks, Mish.
You've been tuning in to the Essential Tax Podcast with your host, Mishkin Santa. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on our website, thewolfgroup.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.